On August 6, 2026, a 9-page document landed on a desk at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, filed by Toyota's own engineering division. And it contains a sentence that Toyota did not put in any commercial, any dealership brochure, or any press release headline. The sentence says that the instrument cluster in over 500,000 brand new Camry Hybrids can go completely blank the moment you start the engine. And when it does, your turn signals stop working, your hazard lights stop working, your seatbelt warning chime goes silent, and the reminder that tells you your key is still in the ignition simply disappears. Not one of those systems fails on its own. They all go down together at the same moment because of one part you've probably never thought about twice. I'm going to walk you through exactly what Toyota filed, in Toyota's own words, and then I'm going to show you something almost nobody covering this story has connected yet, which is that this is not the first time this exact car has done this, and it is not even the second time. By the time we get to the end of this, you're going to know exactly how to check if your Camry is on this list, what Toyota is actually going to do about it, and what the pattern behind 4 recalls in 18 months might be telling you about where this car is headed next. Let's start with what the filing actually says, because the actual language matters more than any headline written about it. The recall covers certain 2025 and 2026 model year Camry Hybrids, and only Camry Hybrids, because Toyota no longer sells a gas-only Camry. That alone is worth sitting with for a second. After 21 years as the best-selling sedan in America, Toyota killed the gas-only engine entirely, starting with the redesigned 2025 model, and bet the entire nameplate on its 5th-generation hybrid system built at the Georgetown, Kentucky plant. Every Camry rolling off that line today is a hybrid. So when something goes wrong with this generation, it doesn't go wrong with a slice of the lineup. It goes wrong with the whole car. Here's the mechanical part, and I'm going to keep it simple because the engineering itself is simple. That's actually the problem. The Camry uses a 7-inch digital combination meter, which is the industry term for the main instrument display sitting directly behind your steering wheel, the one showing your speed, your fuel level, and your warning lights. That display is built by a supplier called Visteon Corporation under 2 separate part numbers depending on production date. According to Toyota's own filing, during the startup sequence, that display can fail to initialize correctly. When it does, the screen goes dark, and here's the part that should stop you cold. Because Toyota routed several independent safety functions through that single screen instead of wiring them separately, the failure doesn't just cost you a speedometer. It takes the turn signals with it, it takes the hazard lights with it, it takes the seatbelt chime with it, it takes the smart key reminder with it. 4 completely different safety systems that used to be wired independently on older cars, systems that have nothing mechanically in common with each other, all going dark because they're now dependent on one screen deciding to boot up correctly. Think about what that actually means on the road. You pull out of your driveway, you signal a lane change, and the car behind you never sees your blinker because the screen that controls it never wakes up. You're stopped on the shoulder after a flat tire. You hit your hazards and nothing happens, because the same failure that blanked your speedometer also silenced the exact system designed to warn other drivers you're stopped. NHTSA's language on this is not vague. Federal regulators state plainly that this increases the risk of a crash, both for drivers who can't see their own warning indicators and for the other drivers around them who have no way of knowing what that driver intends to do next. That is not a marketing language. That is not YouTube exaggeration. That's the federal government's own risk assessment, sitting in the public recall database right now under campaign number 26V5111000. It's worth knowing exactly which federal standards this filing says the affected vehicles may no longer meet, because the list itself tells you how far this reaches. The documentation points to Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 101, which governs how controls and displays have to be labeled and identified so a driver can't actually read them. It points to Standard 108, which governs lighting, meaning your turn signals and hazard lamps specifically. It points to Standard 1 and 14, which covers theft protection and rollaway prevention, the exact territory that Smart Key Warning lives in. And it points to Standard 208, which governs occupant crash protection, the standard your seatbelt warning chime exists to satisfy in the first place. 4 different federal safety standards, 4 different systems, 1 shared point of failure. That's not 4 small problems. That's 1 small problem wearing 4 different uniforms. Now here's the number that actually matters if you own one of these cars, or you're thinking about buying one. 508,354 vehicles in the United States alone. That's the exact figure Toyota reported to federal regulators, not a rounded estimate, not a guess, the literal number sitting in their own paperwork. Add in Canada, at just over 11,000 vehicles and other global markets served by the same 3 plants in the US. Haas in Japan and in Thailand, and the worldwide total climbs to roughly 655,000 Camrys. Production dates on the affected range run from August 15th, 2024, all the way through June 9th, 2026. which tells you this isn't some isolated batch from a bad week on the assembly line. This is a defect that potentially rode along for nearly 2 full years of production before Toyota caught it and reported it. Sit with that production window for a second, because it's doing more work than it looks like at first glance. August 15th, 2024 to June 9th, 2026 is not a short run. That's nearly 22 months of vehicles rolling off 3 separate assembly lines on 2 continents, every single one of them carrying a display that could fail to initialize correctly at startup, and none of it surfacing as a filed recall until August 6th, 2026. That gap between when the earliest affected car left the factory and when the defect became a federal filing is close to 2 years. Somewhere in that window, this component passed whatever internal validation Toyota runs before a part goes into mass production, and it still ended up in front of federal regulators as a startup failure affecting over 500,000 cars. That's not a story about a single bad batch of hardware. That's a story about a validation process that didn't catch a software initialization bug across nearly 2 years of continuous production on a part supplied by an outside vendor rather than built in-house. But before you panic and assume every Camry on the road right now is affected, there's a detail buried in the filing that most headlines skipped entirely. And it's actually good news if you're one of the people it applies to. Only 3 trims carry the smaller 7-inch combination meter that's failing here: the LE, the SE, and the Nightshade. If you're driving an XLE or an XSE, your Camry Hybrid uses a completely different, larger 12, 3-inch digital gauge cluster, built differently, sourced differently, and as of this filing, it is not included in this recall at all. So the very first thing worth doing, if you own a 2025 or 2026 Camry Hybrid, is looking at which trim you actually have, because that single detail cuts the list of vehicles you need to worry about roughly in half before you even check your VIN. Here's what Toyota is actually going to do about it, and I want to walk through this precisely because there's a detail in the remedy that says something bigger about where the entire auto industry is heading. Dealers will perform a free software update on the combination meter to correct the initialization failure at startup. If that reflash doesn't resolve the issue, the dealer will replace the combination meter hardware entirely, also at no cost to the owner. That part is straightforward, and it's exactly what you'd expect from any modern recall. What's not straightforward, and what should genuinely surprise you if you've gotten used to how software updates work on other brands, is that this fix cannot be pushed to your car wirelessly. There is no over-the-air update available for this defect. You cannot fix this from your driveway. You cannot fix this while you sleep. Every single one of those 508,000 vehicles has to physically visit a Toyota dealership and sit in a service bay while a technician connects a cable and reflashes the display by hand. In an era where other manufacturers can patch a software bug the same week it's discovered, Toyota's own newest, most technologically advanced Camry generation still requires an in-person dealer visit to fix a problem that started in a piece of software in the first place. Owner notification letters are scheduled to start mailing on September 21st, 2026, with the full mailing wrapped up by early October. If you own one of the affected trims and you don't want to wait for a letter to show up in your mailbox, Toyota's own VIN lookup tool will tell you today whether your specific car is on the list, and it costs you nothing to check. Let's talk about what this actually costs you, because free is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, and it's worth breaking apart. The part itself is free. The labor is free. What isn't free is your time, and for over 500,000 households, that adds up to a real, if invisible, expense. A dealer software reflash on a combination meter typically means dropping the car off, not a quick 5-minute counter visit, because the technician needs shop time to connect diagnostic equipment, run the update, and verify it actually resolved the startup failure before handing the keys back. Multiply even a conservative estimate of service time across 508,000 vehicles, and you're looking at an enormous, coordinated logistics operation moving through Toyota's dealer network over the following months, competing for the same service bays and the same technician hours as every oil change, every tire rotation, and every other routine appointment already on the books. If you've ever tried to get a same-week service appointment at a busy Toyota dealership, you already know that isn't a small ask. There's also a quieter cost sitting underneath all of this, and it's one that shows up later, at trade-in time, rather than at the service counter. A car with 4 open or recently completed federal safety recalls in under 2 years carries a different story on a vehicle history report than a car with a clean sheet. And while a completed recall isn't a red flag on its own, 4 of them in 18 months is exactly the kind of pattern a sharp used car buyer or a trade-in appraiser is going to notice and quietly factor into an offer. Now here's the part of this story that almost nobody covering it this week has actually connected, and it's the reason this recall matters more than a single blank screen would normally justify. This is not the first time the redesigned hybrid-only Camry has ended up in a federal recall filing. It's not the second time. This is the 4th time in roughly 18 months, and when you line all 4 up in order, a pattern starts to emerge that should genuinely concern anyone shopping for this generation of car. Go back to February of 2025, just months after the redesigned Camry launched. Toyota issued its first recall on this generation, covering certain 2025 Camry and Camry hybrid vehicles over a safety concern involving the second row seating, specifically welded brackets on the head restraints that hadn't been secured to specification, a defect that put those vehicles out of compliance with the federal head restraint safety standard. It was an early stumble, the kind of thing that sometimes happens in the first year of an all-new platform, and on its own, it wouldn't necessarily tell you much. Then came October of 2025. This time, it was the rearview camera. Owners started reporting that the backup camera image could freeze on screen or go completely blank, meaning the driver could be looking at a static picture of an empty driveway while actually backing toward a car, a person, or a wall that had moved into frame seconds earlier. Toyota filed the recall, dealers issued a fix, and the story mostly disappeared from the news cycle within a week. But notice what's already happening here. 2 recalls in, and both of them trace back not to a mechanical part wearing out, but to an electronic system either failing to update correctly or failing to display correctly. 2 recalls into this car's life, some owners were already starting to notice a rhythm to the letters showing up in their mailbox, roughly 1 significant safety campaign every few months since the car launched. It's the kind of pattern that's easy to dismiss when you're only looking at 1 recall at a time, because taken individually, a seatbelt bracket issue and a frozen backup camera don't obviously belong in the same conversation. It's only when you line them up on a single timeline that the shape of what's actually happening starts to come into focus. Then, in December of 2025, the 3rd recall arrived. And this one was serious, in a way the first 2 weren't. Toyota identified that a bolt inside the inverter of the hybrid powertrain, the component responsible for converting the high voltage battery current into the power that actually drives the wheels, could work itself loose over time. If it did, the result wasn't a warning light or a blank screen. The result was a potential short circuit, which could cause a sudden loss of drive power at speed, or, in a worst case, an electrical fire. Toyota's language to affected owners was about as direct as a manufacturer statement gets. Don't drive the vehicle, park it outside, and wait to be contacted about a repair. This recall covered roughly 55,000 vehicles, and it wasn't limited to the Camry. It also swept in the 2026 Corolla Cross Hybrid, which shares elements of the same hybrid architecture. For a car built around Toyota's reputation for mechanical simplicity and long-term reliability, being told to park your brand new sedan outside because it might catch fire is about as far from that reputation as a single recall can travel. And now, less than 8 months after that fire risk recall, we arrive back at the instrument cluster failure we started this entire video with. For on recalls, 1 car. 18 months, a seatbelt bracket, a rearview camera, an inverter bolt that could start a fire, and now a display that takes your turn signals, hazard lights, seatbelt chime, and smart key reminder down with it at the exact moment you start the engine. Here's why that pattern matters, more than any single recall does on its own. Look closely at what's actually failing across these 4 incidents, and a theme becomes impossible to ignore. The seatbelt bracket recall was a manufacturing and welding issue, the one genuinely mechanical failure in the group. Everything else, the camera, the inverter's electronic control, and now the instrument display, traces back to electronics and software rather than the kind of physical wear and tear failures that used to define recall season for decades. That's not a coincidence. And it's not really Toyota specific either. It's the direction the entire industry is heading as cars become rolling computers with wheels attached. But it lands differently on a Toyota specifically, because Toyota's entire brand identity for 2 generations has been built on mechanical simplicity, on engines and systems that outlast the vehicle around them with nothing more than routine maintenance. A car built on that reputation is now generating recalls that have almost nothing to do with mechanical durability and almost everything to do with code, sensors, and displays that either initialize correctly or don't. Now, I want to correct something before it spreads any further because there's a meaningful difference between what actually failed here and what people online are already starting to assume failed, and getting this wrong matters. This recall has nothing to do with Toyota Safety Sense, the camera and radar driver assistance suite that comes standard on every 2026 Camry. That suite, in its current 3, zero form, pairs a windshield-mounted forward camera with a grille-mounted millimeter wave radar unit to run the pre-collision system with pedestrian detection, lane departure alert with steering assist, full speed range, dynamic radar cruise control, and blind spot monitoring. It's genuinely sophisticated hardware, running on its own dedicated processing, separate from the instrument cluster entirely. Nothing in this recall filing touches it, recalibrates it, or disables it. If your Camry's forward collision warning or lane keeping assist has ever acted strangely, that's a separate conversation entirely, tied to windshield replacements or front-end work knocking the camera and radar out of alignment, and it's not what's described in this recall. What actually failed here is far more basic than radar and cameras scanning the road ahead of you. It's the single screen behind your steering wheel that was supposed to just show you your speed, and instead, through a software initialization error, is capable of taking half a dozen driver-facing warning systems down with it. In some ways, that should worry you more, not less, because a radar sensor malfunctioning is the kind of failure people expect from advanced technology, the kind of thing you already know to get checked after a fender bender. A basic instrument cluster failing to turn on and silently disabling your blinkers in the process is the kind of failure people don't expect at all, because it doesn't look like advanced technology. It looks like the one screen in the car that should be the most boring, most reliable piece of hardware in the entire vehicle. There's a reason it's worth being precise about that distinction, instead of just letting a scary headline do the work. Toyota Safety Sense earned its reputation over years of independent testing and real-world use, and folding an unrelated instrument cluster failure into that reputation, even by accident, misrepresents what actually broke and what didn't. The honest version of this story is arguably more unsettling than the inaccurate one, not less, because it says the failure isn't hiding in some exotic new driver assistance technology most owners barely understand. It's hiding in the single, most basic, most stared-at piece of hardware in the entire cabin. The one screen every driver glances at within the first 2 seconds of starting the car, every single time, without ever expecting it might not be there. So what should you actually do with all of this if you're sitting in an affected Camry right now, or you're shopping for one this week? Start with the trim. If you're in an XLE or XSE with the larger 12, 3-inch display, this specific recall doesn't apply to your car. If you're in an LE, SE, or Nightshade with the smaller 7-inch display, and your build date falls between August 15th, 2024 and June 9th, 2026, run your van through Toyota's recall lookup tool today, rather than waiting on a letter that won't start mailing until late September. The fix itself costs you nothing. It's a straightforward dealer software update, and if that doesn't resolve it, a free hardware swap. The genuine inconvenience isn't cost, it's time, because there's no wireless fix here, which means an actual appointment, actual drop-off, and actual waiting for a problem that, on a more software-forward vehicle, could theoretically have been solved overnight without you ever touching a key fob. In the meantime, if your display does go blank at startup, don't assume your car is simply glitching and drive off anyway. You've lost your turn signals and your hazard lights the moment that happens. And the two things every other driver around you relies on to predict what you're about to do are both gone. If you're shopping for one of these cars used, specifically a 2025 or early 2026 model, this is exactly the kind of detail worth checking before you sign anything, not after. Ask for the VN before you commit to a test drive, run it through the recall lookup yourself, and specifically confirm whether the open recalls, all 4 of them at this point, have actually been completed, not just scheduled. A completed recall history costs you nothing extra to verify and takes about 2 minutes, and it tells you whether you're buying a car that's already been through its fixes or a car that's still carrying open safety campaigns that the previous owner never bothered to schedule. It's also worth asking the seller directly, in person, whether they personally experienced any of these 4 issues, rather than relying only on the paperwork. A completed recall tells you a fix was applied. It doesn't always tell you whether the underlying part failed once and got fixed, or whether it was replaced preemptively before it ever caused a problem at all. Both are technically the same line on a vehicle history report, but they're a genuinely different ownership experience. And a seller who's driven the car day to day is going to know which one it was, even if the paperwork can't tell you. Zoom out for a second, because the bigger story here isn't really about one blank screen. It's about what happens when a manufacturer with decades of built reputation on mechanical reliability starts competing on the same technological ground as everyone else, adding more screens, more software-dependent systems, more single points, where one piece of code failing takes multiple safety functions down with it at once. The old failure mode for a car at this mileage and this age used to be a worn part, a belt, a bearing, something you could see wearing down before it actually broke. The new failure mode is a line of code that either boots correctly at 6 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, or it doesn't. And when it doesn't just cost you a speedometer. It costs you the systems every driver around you depends on to know what you're about to do next. That's a fundamentally different kind of risk than the one people have spent decades associating with buying a Toyota. And whether that trade-off, more technology, more convenience, more integrated systems, is worth the new failure modes that come with it, is a question every buyer of this generation of Camry is going to have to answer for themselves. This isn't unique to Toyota, and it's worth saying that plainly instead of pretending one brand invented the problem. Consolidating multiple independent functions onto a single shared display, instead of wiring each one separately with its own dedicated circuit, is a cost and complexity decision the entire auto industry has been making for years. because fewer physical components generally means simpler assembly and lower manufacturing cost per vehicle. Most of the time, that trade-off is invisible because most of the time the software boots correctly and nobody ever thinks about it. The Camry's instrument cluster recall is what happens on the rare occasion it doesn't, and it's a preview of the kind of recall the entire industry is going to be issuing more of going forward, not fewer, as more functions get folded into fewer, more centralized pieces of hardware. A worn brake pad tells you it's wearing out before it fails completely, usually with a squeal you can hear from the driveway. A software initialization bug gives you no warning at all. It works perfectly on 10,000 cold starts in a row, and then on the 10,001st, for reasons that may vary slightly from vehicle to vehicle, it doesn't. That unpredictability is the actual story underneath this recall, more than the specific number of vehicles or the specific systems affected. Here's the actual bottom line, stated plainly. Toyota has now filed 4 separate recalls on the redesigned all-hybrid Camry in about 18 months, and the most recent one, covering over 500,000 vehicles in the US, alone involves a single display that can silently take your turn signals, hazard lights, seatbelt chime, and smart key reminder down with it the moment it fails to initialize. The fix is free. The inconvenience is real because there's no over-the-air option, and you have to physically visit a dealer. And the pattern across all 4 recalls, 3 of them tracing back to electronics and software rather than traditional mechanical wear, is worth paying attention to whether you already own one of these cars or you're deciding whether to buy one. None of this means the redesigned Camry is a bad car, and it's worth being fair about that before we close this out. A 4-recall stretch in a car's first 18 months on sale isn't unheard of for an all-new platform, especially one built around a 5th-generation hybrid system that's more electronically complex than anything Toyota has put under a Camry's hood before. What it does mean is that the old shortcut, buy a Toyota, stop thinking about it, doesn't apply quite the same way to a car that is dependent on software behaving correctly across every single startup cycle for the next 15 years. The mechanical bones underneath this generation may well prove every bit as durable as the Camrys that came before it. But durability isn't just about how long an engine lasts anymore. It's also about how many independent systems are quietly depending on the same 6 inches of glass behind your steering wheel to boot up correctly every single morning. And that's a question this car's first 18 months on the road has already answered 4 separate times. If this is the first you're hearing about any of this, that's exactly the gap this channel exists to close. Because the recall itself sits in a public federal database that almost nobody checks. And the internal bulletins telling dealers exactly how to diagnose and fix it are documents that never make it in front of an owner unless they go looking. Drop a comment telling me which of these 4 recalls, if any, actually showed up in your mailbox, because I want to know how many of you got the seatbelt letter, the camera letter, the fire risk letter, or this one. And if you found this useful, subscribe, because there's more coming on exactly what's driving Toyota's recall numbers up across its entire hybrid lineup this year, not just the Camry, and it connects to a supplier decision made 3 years before any of these cars ever reached a dealer lot. I'll see you in the next one.